This is the Game Philosopher, and today we're talking about something that's kind of original, but not really original, but it is super original because we're talking about the original sin, even though this is a philosophy channel and not a theology channel. Now, the original sin is a concept that comes from St. Augustine, and if you talk about it in any theological circles, you will have a mixed bag. It doesn't matter if you're talking with people who are Protestant, Orthodox, or Catholic. Some people like it, some people don't like it, some people understand it, some people don't. Actually, a lot of people do not understand it, and there's two big reasons. The first big reason is that of St. Augustine. He doesn't really explain it too well, and if you do not use his way of interpretation, it's going to be really hard to get because there are two different schools of ancient theological thought. And the first one was Antiochian, which is more of a literalist school that thought it was better to interpret the scriptures literally of the Christian religion. And they tended to follow the methods used by Aristotle and in the Organon, which I will talk about in a later video when I feel it's necessary to talk about logic. But the other school of thought was the Alexandrian. And the Alexandrian school was more into the abstracts. They were more Platonic. Their school of thought came in part influenced by Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish philosopher and Platonist who wrote a allegorical commentary on Genesis and a bunch of other really great books, which I will talk about in a later episode. But needless to say, you take these two, you will find it's kind of hard to explain St. Augustine. Now, if you were to take the Antiochian school, though, it's a little bit closer, but it's not quite, because when you look at St. Augustine, you have to use his way of interpreting things, and his way kind of morphs them both together when you read On Christian Doctrine. And it's a very particular method, which I will not talk about because that would take too much time. Now, when you look at the controversial side also, that the next reason being that people like to look at commentaries and they don't really want to consider the sources themselves, so they end up thinking about it like a Lutheran or like a Calvinist or Catholic or like traditional Augustinianism. And so they miss the big point, and this is a big flaw when it comes to intellectual honesty. Let's just keep it at that. But one thing's for sure, though. If we look at the history of Augustinianism, it's been very influential. It's been cited by many philosophers, from Hegel to Kierkegaard, and to many different theologians and psychologists, and even by religious people and by atheists, such as Alain de Botton, who wrote he did a very good video on St. Augustine, which I will not link in the description because I'm not going to get much attention anyway with these videos because I don't really advertise them very well, so it would be stupid. But anyway, St. Augustine is both controversial and very influential all at the same time. Now, one of the interesting things to talk about, though, is the big scripture that everyone talks about is Romans, where Saint Paul is talking about how Adam, due to his sin, that sin and death was brought into the world. And St. Augustine is talking about this when he's talking about original sin. And this causes a big controversy, and yet at the same time, this controversy was not so much prevalent in his day, except for probably between him and St. John Cassian. But at the same time, it's there because he was trying to refute Pelagius, and they were discussing infant baptism. Now, since this is a philosophy channel, I will not talk about infant baptism at all, because that would be totally irrelevant, because I'm not a religious studies channel. If you wish to study any channel with religious studies, go to our friends at Religion for Breakfast, because they actually have some pretty great videos on anything related to religious studies, and you will enjoy it. So, original sin is a good concept for the discussion, because it's a concept which deals with a lot of times our ways of thinking about humanity. Like, are we evil? Are we good? Why is evil always present in the world? And a bunch of other things that we see in a lot of discussion, actually, not just in theology or philosophy, but all around the world, that it's just something we can't avoid. And furthermore, when it comes to patristic discussions, there have been attempts to correct St. Augustine and even criticize him by coming up with the idea of ancestral sin. Now, the big problem with this, though, is that ancestral sin, when you look at the arguments, it sounds a lot like Augustinianism, and it's really just trying to take a petty attack on the definition of guilt. Now, this petty attack itself is just begging a question and trying to find a reason to disagree. Now, I know that's not really the same thing as what begging the question is logically, but that does happen, and I think it's just one little thing that where people take a little disagreement and then they say Augustine is very wrong, and I think that's a very unfair thing that people like to do. Now, talking about the proof of original sin, it's very important to do this because original sin itself needs to be understood, right? So the first proof given, of course, is therefore just as one man entered the world and death through sin happened, and thus spread to all men because all have sinned. That's, of course, I just referenced that one, which proves that there was an original sinner. And then another proof, which is actually given in the Catechism of St. Augustine, also known as the Enchiridion, depending on who translates it, I shall punish the children for the iniquity of their parents, which is found in Exodus, but it's also found in Deuteronomy in the 5th chapter, verse 9. Now, the big thing about this is that, yes, these verses do not really relate so much, because I shall punish the children for the iniquities of their parents. That actually is more referencing a particular thing that happened in Exodus, and it's not really talking about the sins that people do in general, or is it? So, when the sin happens, sin was brought in the world, and temptation and demons come, according to theology, that people start doing evil stuff and they start dying and all, and that is very, very much a result of original sin, and that's really the big thing of St. Augustine, and that's what he points out. And that's not so much the idea that St. Augustine is particularly attacked on, but rather because he thinks that everyone inherits the guilt, according to some. And I'm not going to get into it too much because it's just one definition, and I think that's very unfair to try to take one definition and try to dismantle a whole entire philosophy just because one simple, small definition that may be erroneous, may not. So further, we have evidence that evil does exist in the world, not only by the scriptures, but by the fact that of experience, which Hegel talks about in his philosophy on logic. But back to the evidence from theology and from the scriptures that would suggest such. And all this is where I'm not talking about it from St. Augustine's treatise, but rather from my own research into this topic. You have a few verses where it does imply original sin, such as from the writings of St. John, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Again, that relates back to that Romans verse. And Job, the book says, how then can man be righteous before God? Or how can he be pure who was born of a woman? So that's really showing right there that man is not pure the moment he is born. I know some will disagree with me on this, and that's fine. If you have any refutations, put in the comments. And also in the Psalter, do not enter into judgment with your servant, for in your sight none living is righteous. So in other words, no one is free of sin, and no one is totally good. And you also have in the Genesis that the woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I ate, which of course shows not only what I've talked about before, which sin itself is in the world, but how people psychologically deal with things. So as a result of this original sin, people blame their problems on other people, and yes, these people might be causing the problem, but it was not particularly their fault that you actually did this problem. Now, on the idea of guilt, I will have to say that St. Augustine, to my knowledge, I've read not all of his works, but a lot of his works. I have not seen anywhere other than where people would try to define it without really talking about anything he's really said, that people inherit the guilt. So either I'm mistaken in the interpretation of St. Augustine, or people are looking at commentaries and not really wanting to talk too much. But at the same time, since I do not know Greek or Latin, I can't, to the extent to where I could actually talk about it. Of course, I don't really have any of St. Augustine's works in Latin, so I can't really refute it too much. But to my knowledge, from reading it in English, guilt is not really his point. It's not that man necessarily inherits the guilt, but man is affected by original sin. And people get caught up on the original sin concept because it's very much something that the Catholics have spun to whatever degree they want to talk about it. And that's not so much something St. Augustine did. And furthermore, looking at the origin of the concept of original sin, actually, to be surprising, it does not come from St. Augustine so much as it comes from St. Ambrose of Milan, who actually, in one of his works, he quotes a particular scripture, but it's kind of odd, because it talked about original sin, which when I looked at it, of course, there was no mention in the scripture itself of original sin, so it must be that it's from a Latin translation of the Bible, probably the Tala, where the term original sin shows up, and so it's not totally St. Augustine's fault, but that's none of my business. I'm just here to enlighten you guys with some good philosophy content and comedy. So, if you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, leave a comment in the form of an argument. Just do that in the form of an argument and tell me your agreements and your disagreements, your questions, and have fun with the discussion.